get Britain into the common market, part 2 of The Poisoned Chalice.
In 1970, a new Europe began to take shape. The French buried Charles de Gaulle, the Frenchman who had said no to British entry. Britain elected a new Prime Minister, Edward Heath, of all politicians the most committed to getting Britain in.
Our purpose is not to divide, but to unite.
Heath never disguised his own determination to negotiate Britain's entry into the European club, but he knew that the country was deeply divided on the issue. And so he used 3 words that would come to haunt him and other British leaders for a generation. Entry, he said, could only take place with the full-hearted consent of the British people.
No British government could possibly take this country into the common market against the wish of the British people.
In the game of politics, phrases like that mean different things to different people. The moves that followed led to bitterness, intrigue, and charges of downright deception. The voters were pawns in each side's propaganda.
They were misled, they were conned, they were cheated.
When it was over, the game had left wounds that would never heal.
I felt that a great national mistake had been made.
The Labour and Conservative parties would both bear the scars of battle for decades.
It began the split in the Labour Party, which ended with the creation of the Social Democratic Party.
And as we know, Heath's game settled nothing.
Ted was right when he said you could only do a thing like this with the full-hearted consent of the people, but he knew he hadn't got it. And this is coming home to roost upon his successors.
I've been shopping for 6 hours. What have you bought then? Nothing. Nothing at all. A complete waste of time. Wicked, isn't it? Wicked. It'll be worse when we join the common market. That nice Mr. Heath would never allow that.
Though stiff and moody, Heath was also a man of deeply held passions for music, sailing, and linking Britain's destiny with Europe. The key to entry lay with Britain's old enemies in Paris. Heath's secret weapon was Christopher Soames, once a Conservative minister, now the bon vivant ambassador to France. Soames was charged with opening a private line of communication between Downing Street and the new French president, Georges Pompidou. By chance, Heath had already struck up a friendship with Pompidou's right-hand man. His name was Michel Jobert.
M. Pompidou m'a posé 2 questions. Comment est-il? Quelle confiance peut-on lui faire? Alors j'ai répondu aux 2 questions. Comme je vous réponds aujourd'hui, comment est-il? Et quelle confiance peut-on lui faire? J'ai répondu que c'était probablement le seul Britannique qui croyait à l'Europe, telle qu'elle était dessinée à cette époque.
And so secret talks started in Paris. The task of Soames was to ensure that France would not veto British membership again.
One aspect of it was the astonishing fact that President Pompidou conducted these very important talks without the knowledge of either his own Prime Minister, Chaban-Delmas, or his Foreign Secretary, Maurice Schumann. It seems quite extraordinary, but it was so.
In Brussels, meanwhile, Heath's Minister for Europe, Geoffrey Rippon, was officially negotiating with all 6 common market countries. The British were desperate that knowledge of their secret talks in Paris should not leak out.
It could have been very damaging, of course, if it had been known to the other members of the community that this was going on, even though they would have understood that it was in the best possible cause.
Into the new world, come out of the past.
You are right in saying that we have had a...
The Brussels talks ground on, mired in the humdrum business of farm prices and Commonwealth trade. The French, on the surface, were tough adversaries.
One of the things that worried the French was the risk they said they were taking in allowing in a weak economy. Fortunately, our economy at that time was getting rather stronger. But we had to say our economy is strong. Well, they say if your economy is so strong, you could make quite a good contribution.
In May 1971, the 2 strands came together. Heath needed to short-circuit the Brussels talks. He could only do so by getting the French on side. It was time to go as a supplicant to the court of Pompidou, a meeting that had taken Soames 6 months to arrange.
I knew that to settle all of this, it had to be the French president who did it, and the only person who could with the French president was myself as Prime Minister.
Palace, scene of the vital talks on the common market between the French President, Monsieur Pompidou, and our Prime Minister. The talks are regarded as the final make-or-break attempt to get Britain into the European Economic Community.
The Paris meeting could not be allowed to fail. Before his arrival, Heath immersed himself in preparation.
Ted Heath was a very thorough man. It was a cheerful, warm spring, and I remember him sitting out in the garden at number 10, and people coming and talking to him about New Zealand butter, talking to him about the Sterling area, talking to him about the financial arrangements, talking to him so that he really absorbed into himself the detail of the discussion.
In the end, the detail was immaterial. The key thing was to establish the principle of French support for British entry. Over many hours of talks and banquets, President and Prime Minister began to find a common understanding. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. The next day, Pompidou turned up at the British Embassy for lunch. It was a virtually unprecedented gesture, but Soames knew that the way to a Frenchman's heart was through his stomach.
C'est important, c'est vrai qu'il y a la diplomatie de la gastronomie. Les plus lamentables étant les Américains à cet égard. Absolument, pour un Français, préoccupant, pour choisir un terme modeste. Mais là, avec Soames à l'ambassade, il n'y avait aucun risque. Et il n'y en a eu aucun.
I remember we had salmon with a mayonnaise, with a mint mayonnaise to start with. Actually, it was a sea trout which had come down from Scotland. We had English lamb, I think it was, and we had some seriously spectacular wines, which was, I think, a 55 claret and 35 port. And I think we had Chateau Yquem with the very exciting suite, all in real Soames style.
Inside the embassy, if there'd been any doubt about the prevailing atmosphere between the 2 heads of government, that was dispelled at once in the way they reacted to each other. It seemed to bear out this evening's headline, in English, in the Paris newspaper François. Pompidou Heath's smiling day.
After the pudding, it was off to the Salle des Fêtes at the Élysée Palace, the very room where 8 years earlier de Gaulle had turned Britain down. Now, basking in the warm glow of claret and sauterne, Heath and Pompidou held a historic press conference.
This was the very room in which de Gaulle had pronounced the veto. And when Pompidou made his famous remark, there are those who say that France is determined to exclude Britain, and those who say that Britain does not have a European vocation, and you see before you two men who are convinced of the contrary,
Ils sont convaincus du contraire.
it was a marvelous moment. I had no idea he was going to say anything of that kind. And at this moment, when I recovered myself, because I was moved by this, I looked at the correspondence, and there were many wet eyes in the room.
For Heath, this was a moment of unalloyed triumph. He knew the formal negotiations in Brussels were not over, but he also knew the French veto was a thing of the past. From Paris to Brussels, from high politics to cheese. Geoffrey Rippon's talks moved rapidly to a conclusion. Britain's effective entry fee into the club was fixed at £500 million a year. All remaining details were settled in a round-the-clock session that lasted 3 days.
We were left simply at the end with New Zealand dairy products, taking cheese and milk together, and our contribution to the budget. We had to settle New Zealand on favourable terms because that really was an important political issue in the House of Commons.
The dawn broke and the celebrations began.
The great windows at the end of the council chamber were blood red with the dawn, and people began to clap. And we felt that it had been a turning point in history. And then the champagne was produced.
You can turn it into a loving cup. You can have the other side of the glass.
It all went very well. I mean, there was general approval of what had been achieved. Obviously, critics were still saying we'd given away too much, but the general impression was that it was all right. It was virtually over.
But it wasn't. Heath might have squared the French and the other Europeans. He now had to win over the members of the British Parliament. Claret wouldn't be enough this time. What Heath needed was skill in the black arts of the Palace of Westminster. In Britain, Europe was becoming a dominant issue across the political spectrum. Farmers were worried about the common agricultural policy. Consumers worried about higher food prices and jobs. And it wasn't just economics. Britain started to hear a word that had hardly been mentioned in Brussels and Paris: sovereignty. That piece was placed on the board by Heath's former cabinet colleague, Enoch Powell.
I do not believe that this nation, which has maintained and defended its independence for 1,000 years, will now submit to see it merged or lost. Nor did I become a member of our sovereign parliament in order to consent to that sovereignty being abated or transferred.
The Labour Party was coming apart. In 1967, the Labour government had tried to join the community. Now in opposition, the majority of Labour MPs were opposed, though some senior members of the party remained passionately devoted to the European cause.
It is an opportunity which offers great benefits for us and great benefits for Europe as a whole.
Harold Wilson, Labour's leader, knew that a commitment on Europe either way could break up his party. So he waffled.
I'm not going to say we should go in, whatever the terms. I'm not going to say we should stay out. We must wait for the terms.
Now the terms were known, and Wilson had to come off the fence. In fact, he was pushed off it by a speech in May 1971 given by his shadow Foreign Secretary, James Callaghan.
If we have to prove our Europeanism by accepting that French is the dominant language in the community, then my answer is quite clear. And I will say it in French in order to prevent any misunderstanding. Non, merci beaucoup.
It was seen quite rightly by Wilson as if he stepped into a pro-European position, he would be outflanked by Jim Callaghan and challenged for the leadership. It's a powerful speech.
Wilson was always slightly nervous of Callahan. He saw him as a sort of big and potentially menacing fish lurking in the shadows and the stillness of a rock pool, as it were.
The issue now was a parliamentary vote on a white paper which set out the terms of membership. The official Labour line was to vote against. That meant that the small number of anti-marketeers on the Tory benches were dangerous. Heath's first instinct was to crack them into order with a three-line whip.
If you had a free vote Prime Minister on your side, you would not get a majority from your own side, would you? You have no evidence of that. Do you deny it? Yes. How can you possibly know that? Then why are you afraid of having a free vote? Because I said that on a major issue such as this, the government is absolutely entitled to ask for its support.
But there was an alternative. If Number 10 allowed the Tories a free vote, enough pro-market Labour MPs might vote with their conscience to give the government a clear majority. The gambit was dreamt up just down the street by the old fox, Francis Pym, then Chief Whip.
Our overall majority in the Commons was only 25, and we had something like 18 determined anti-marketeers, so that our majority on this issue, if the Labour Party were united against us, was clearly extremely vulnerable.
The great parliamentary debate on Europe was fought for 6 days on the floor of the House. Many MPs have described it as the greatest debate in Britain's parliamentary history.
Heath was eventually persuaded. When the big vote came in October 1971, Pym's strategy worked. Despite Labour's three-line whip, enough Labour MPs voted with the government to give Heath a huge majority of 112.
We watched sort of hawk-like as each person broke away and came into the lobby, and everybody was being watched very closely to see what way they went and how they voted. But we had a sense, almost, I think, of solidarity that made it actually quite hard not to vote in the yes lobby.
And then the tellers came in, and this enormous majority was announced, mainly because Roy Jenkins had had the courage to lead 68 Labour MPs into the Ayes lobby to vote for it. And there was pandemonium on the Labour benches.
It's one of the few times, I think, ever I've heard in the House of Commons bad language being used. You know, it's not the kind of thing you normally do, but bad language was used that night.
I remember someone crying out at Roy Jenkins, "Fessis bastard." It was an ugly moment.
There were one or two, how shall I put it, disobliging remarks, but that was very much from a rather excitable little fringe of individuals. I said to him, the sooner you voted, the best thing you can do is show off, get off the premises, don't hang around, don't sit about looking either pious or triumphant or self-righteous. Just go home straight away.
But the parliamentary vote was in favour of joining the Six with a majority of 112 for the government.
Never again would Heath have such a triumph in Britain. Harold Macmillan, his old boss, lit a bonfire of celebration on the cliffs of Dover. Little did he know, the fire lit that night would smoulder for decades, burning first Labour and then the Tories.
Well, I remember calling out to a member of the government who was leaving after the division, "It won't do, it won't do." They still think it won't do.
But who worried about Powell? Heath arrived at the Egmont Palace in Brussels on the 22nd of January 1972 to sign the Treaty of Accession. At the third attempt, and 8 years after Heath himself had been rebuffed, Britain was in.
Wilson had been asked to represent the Labour Party. He decided to go to a football match. That was, he thought, more important. George Brown appeared, and Harold Macmillan appeared.
Well, I remember, you know, we marched into the great gathering, or we were on our way to march in, when somebody threw a bottle of ink over Ted Heath.
Most unfortunate lot, normal ink, but sort of Indian ink, black and sticky, very accurately, by a German lady. Mr. Heath was thrust into a lift and somebody pressed a button and he disappeared. And it's almost unbelievable, but it took about a quarter of an hour to find him.
Anyhow, the problem was to clean up the Prime Minister. The ink had gone over his head as well, and his hair and one side of his face, and it was very difficult to shift.
And then suddenly Alec Douglas Hume went missing, and there was even a suggestion that he'd been kidnapped, but in fact he was just simply gone off rather typically to the laboratory and was washing his own shirt, which had had a splatter of ink on it.
Poor Ted. It took the flunkies over an hour to clean him up and find a new set of clothes. The treaty was signed, but the celebrations were premature. Heath now had to get Parliament to pass a bill which would make membership, with all its obligations, a matter of British law. His opponents thought the legal aspects of this were so complicated that a huge bill would be needed, perhaps 1,000 clauses long, and that they might soon be celebrating the bill's demise.
Of course we can stop them. The mountain of legislation required for that purpose can be held up in Parliament until we get what British democracy requires, the right to choose.
Heath now made a move of stunning audacity. The bill, encompassing huge constitutional changes, would be very short, just 12 clauses.
The simplicity of the bill overwhelmed all that saw it. I think the government was as delighted with it as the opposition was horrified by it.
The opposition had thought that it might be a 1,000-clause bill.
Of course, but they were wrong. And those who were opposed to it, like Michael Foot and Peter Shaw, who for some strange reason were given by Wilson the job of handling it for the Labour Party, wanted to have the greatest possible excuse for holding up the whole thing for years and wrecking it. That's why they demanded 1,000 clauses. There's no justification for
it. Short as the bill was, the parliamentary struggle was set to last for months. And this time, the arithmetic would be much tighter. The pro-market Labour MPs had said they would now obey the party whip and vote against the government. So the question was, were there enough Tories?
Those who would support the government through thick and thin because they were Europeans in their outlook, we called the robust. And we indicated them on our daily list with a blue sign, a blue tick. On the other extreme would be those who we could never persuade, and they would have some good reasons, some bad reasons for voting against the government, and we gave them the collective title of the shits, and we marked them off with a brown pencil. And then in the middle, there was a larger group than the others, which we called the wets. And it was a term, in fact, invented by the then Chief Whip, Francis Pym.
Any loss of a vote or any setback in the course of this passage was a blow to the whole standing of the government and the whole position. So the stakes just could not have been higher.
Outside the House of Commons, the debate was getting hotter. Anti-market protesters accused Heath and his supporters of betraying Britain. Inside the Commons, Heath and Pym now knew that bullying the Tories into line would not be enough. They needed extra ammunition. There was only one place to go, to the Labour pro-marketeers. A secret deal was done, which meant that during the passage of the bill, the government would never lose a single vote.
The Labour Party knew, and those pro-Europeans in the Labour Party knew, that I wasn't asking for anything excessive, that I had my back to the wall, and when we needed a bit of help, they provided it, and they knew we were not asking for anything excessive.
We always knew, and the whips knew, that if they were wanted, they would come.
How did you know that?
In the usual way.
There was nothing usual about it. A quiet back channel was arranged between the Tories and the pro-market Labour MPs. In hindsight, this was astonishing. Heath's government was by now very unpopular, and those votes could have brought it down. 24 years on, those in the know still squirm with embarrassment.
Well, there was no collusion in which I was involved, but the government was never defeated. I think I was sort of kept away from anything like that.
People disappeared, they went to the films, they just didn't show up and so forth. There was quite a bit of quiet understanding that there were certain amendments where it was better for people to just find themselves, you know, speaking at a meeting in Little Gainsborough or something, so that they wouldn't be there.
At the heart of the plot was a red book, never before made public, kept by the pro-European Labour MP, John Roper. He guaranteed that there would be just enough Labour abstentions for the government to win every vote.
The tactic was to try and ensure that we got the bill through, but without having a phalanx of 20 to 25 Labour pro-Europeans who were abstaining right through the bill. And in order to do that, we had different groups of people. I was able to keep records throughout the bill, and I knew the people who I could rely on, and I knew others who I could turn to when it was necessary. So we were able to vary the abstentions and thereby to ensure the bill got through, but cause the minimal disruption to the parliamentary party.
It was a secret. It was a secret arrangement. I mean, everybody knew what was happening. How it was happening, nobody quite knew, and that seemed to me very satisfactory.
It may not have been pretty, but the bill went through. On New Year's Eve, British residents in Brussels celebrated as Britain finally joined the European club.
Officially, we became members at midnight local time, but to make doubly sure, they kept things going for another hour until midnight Greenwich time sounded in London.
I don't think that people understood. They didn't care. They didn't take any notice of a bill being passed which solemnly renounced the supremacy of Parliament in legislation, in control of finance, and which subordinated the courts of this country to the courts of the European community.
It was a coup d'etat by a political class who didn't believe in popular sovereignty. That's what it was. It was a coup d'etat. The power was seized by parliamentarians. They seized power that didn't belong to them, and they used it to take away the rights from those they represented. That's how I saw it.
On New Year's Day in 1973, a Foreign Office official delivered the signed documents that finally sealed Britain's membership.
Letters were accepted by one of the departmental directors general on the 15th floor landing.
The formal decisions by Her Majesty's government recording their assent to the decisions by the Council of the Member States and of the Council.
But even before these formalities, Heath, Pompidou and their European partners had been discussing radical plans. They went far beyond anything in the minds of most MPs. Roy Denman was one of the first to hear what was afoot.
I was across at number 10 when the message came in from Pompidou setting the agenda for the meeting. And the center point of it was a move towards economic and monetary union, which Pompidou suggested we should aim at for 1980. And we saw this. Heath then came in and read the message, made no comment. And then Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the Foreign Secretary, also came in, read it, and he looked across at Ted Heath and said, don't think the House will like this very much, Ted.
Is that what Alec Hume said?
To which Heath said, but that, Alec, is what it's all about.
Well, that's what it was about. And we'd have got it had it not been for the Middle East.
But the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 was the least of Heath's problems. His government was collapsing. Petrol was rationed, the miners went on strike, and people were told to brush their teeth in the dark during the three-day week. Heath called a general election for February 1974. 4 days before polling, Enoch Powell took his revenge. he effectively told his supporters to vote Labour.
Since you and I are united in our dislike of British membership of this EEC, like this, then we know how to set about using this election to get what we want.
So unpopular was Heath that even Wilson looked a decent bet.
There's been a big swing to us this week the polls haven't caught up with. We know what's happening on the doorstep. Look at this.
Barely a year after leading Britain into Europe, Heath was out of Downing Street and Wilson was back in.
We've got a job to do. We can only do that job as one people, and I'm going right in to start that job now.
One people? Wilson didn't even have one party. His cabinet and his MPs were bitterly divided on the European question. There was a real chance that without classic Wilsonian moves, Labour would fall apart. Some years earlier, one such ploy had been proposed by Tony Benn. Other European countries had held referendums on membership. Why not Britain?
Government, Whitehall, and the whole of Fleet Street are still trying to brainwash the British people, of all people, into believing that we are quite unfitted to exercise the same basic right of self-determination.
I came out with this idea, put it to the Shadow Cabinet. I was in a minority of one. And Callaghan said at the end, well, whatever we may have decided, Tony may have launched a little rubber life raft into which one day we may all wish to clamber.
To begin with, Wilson disdained Benn's life raft. But as the sea got choppier, he would change his mind.
We had a meeting of the Shadow Cabinet, and indeed a vote on the referendum, and it was decisively defeated by about 3 or 4 to 1, with Harold Wilson voting against it.
Is it correct to assume that if Mr. Wilson sees the polls are going against him, that he'll say at the last minute that he will allow a referendum on the common market?
The answer to that is no. I've given my answer many times. I don't change it because polls go either up or down.
And then suddenly he swung round, and there was another meeting exactly 2 weeks later, in which it was carried by a majority of one only, but it was carried.
I do believe the British people, in view of all that's happened, must have the last, final word through the ballot box in a referendum.
So his deputy leader resigned.
This was no way to run an opposition, chopping and changing from fortnight to fortnight, from week to week, as it were, within 2 weeks. And not on any grounds of changed beliefs, but on grounds of purely opportunist politics.
So now Labour was back in power, having promised first a fundamental renegotiation of the terms of entry, and second, a referendum. The man in charge was James Callaghan, old Monsieur Non Merci himself.
I was astounded by how anti-Europe Jim was. And I was rather depressed because I thought the negotiation was going to break down and Jim Callaghan is going to come back from Brussels one day and say we must leave the community.
The mandarins of the Foreign Office were used to domestic policy changing. Changing foreign policy overnight was quite another matter. Callaghan summoned all the British ambassadors in community countries to a frosty meeting in his office.
He called all the ambassadors together, came in, opened his blue Foreign Office box, and took out 8 copies of the Labour Party's manifesto, which he handed round to the ambassadors. Made a joke about them having to pay for them, and they weren't quite sure whether this was a joke or not. I mean, some were half fumbling for change in their pockets, and then told them the page on which to open the manifesto, which they duly did. And Jim said, would you read the paragraphs on Britain in Europe? They weren't quite sure whether they're supposed to read these tout ensemble out loud or whether they're supposed to, but they read them. And Jim said, I thought you'd like to know this is our European policy.
We, I suppose, rather cynical Foreign Office people thought this a bit odd.
Did you do that?
I don't think we did do the manifesto. No, I honestly never got the manifesto out and started reading it. No, I never did that.
The renegotiation that we were pledged to by our manifestos in 1974, binding the next Labour government, was a fundamental renegotiation. Those are the words deliberately inserted.
The manifesto looked as though it had been written to make it impossible for a renegotiation to succeed. For example, the manifesto suggested that we should withdraw from the agricultural price negotiations. Had we done that, we would have been on a slippery slope towards leaving the community.
The Foreign Office may not have thought that was an option, but to all intents and purposes, Callaghan did. So the Mandarins quietly, as is their way, went about making sure that their view of Europe, and not that of the Labour anti-marketeers, prevailed.
The Foreign Office, who professionally obviously wanted Britain to have influence in the world, and for very good reasons, because unless we have influence we can't protect British interests, were naturally disposed to make a success of our membership.
We're renegotiating, and at the end of the period of renegotiation, it will be important for us to decide, both in Europe's interest and in Britain's interest, whether this is an arrangement that is suitable and agreeable and worthwhile to both of us.
Jim Callaghan went to Brussels as Foreign Secretary and made the first speech, which sounded very tough and reassure people. But then every point was conceded. And at the very end, the constitutional question, which was the really important one, was never discussed.
For all his early brio, Callaghan was trapped. He couldn't truly renegotiate a treaty that had already been signed. Gradually, his position on Europe began to soften.
I suspect that he came to a conclusion very early on, either that a fundamental renegotiation was impractical, or that it wasn't worth the fury and the difficulties of disengagement that might follow.
I once described it rather cynically as not so much an exercise in renegotiation as an exercise in the European education of Mr. Callaghan. And that, from that point of view, and to some extent Mr. Wilson, but to some extent that worked rather well.
Harold Wilson's next move was risky. He invited the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, a Social Democrat, to address a special Labour Party conference. Schmidt accepted the invitation.
It was unclear to me whether Harold Wilson really wanted to stay inside the community. He always left his options open. And I would not have been surprised if he had taken Britain out again.
The danger was that his British comrades would see an aggressively pro-market argument as interfering in domestic politics. Barbara Castle sent Schmidt some advice through the German ambassador.
I warned the ambassador that if Helmut, who could be an aggressive man, I knew him quite well, of course, were to take that line, he would face booing and possibly a slow hand clap. People might even walk out on him. And that his only hope was to talk to them as a socialist, fellow socialist.
Your comrades on the continent want you to stay, and you, please, will have to weigh this if you talk of solidarity. You have to weigh it.
Helmut's speech was absolutely masterly. I could see that my advice had been relayed to him, and he was following it step by step. I noted in my diary that night that probably I hired the anti-marketeer had done more than anybody to help keep Britain in the common market.
I'm not going to interfere with your decision, and of course I'm not going to shoot from the hip at high noon, as somebody has pointed.
Even the people who were opposed to him, the anti-marketeers, gave him a standing ovation at the end. It didn't change the vote, but in a sense it changed the atmosphere, and I think he looked very good in the country.
Shortly afterwards, Schmidt and Wilson met at Chequers and did a deal. Wilson would campaign for staying in. Schmidt would give Wilson just enough concessions to claim that the renegotiations had worked.
if he was to let Britain stay within the community, it was necessary to give him some success in the renegotiations.
At the Dublin summit in March 1975, it was all smiles. It was Wilson's 59th birthday. Joined by the new French president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Wilson celebrated as a great victory something that had just been a ruse to hold Labour together.
Nothing fundamental came out of the renegotiation. Nothing fundamental could have come out of the renegotiation. And it was essentially a brilliant ploy by Harold Wilson to make the antis feel that their position had been taken seriously and every possible attempt had been made to meet it. But, you know, sadly, unfortunately, our European colleagues were not very sympathetic, so there was only a certain amount we could do. I thought it was very clever. It was a sort of brilliant waltz.
5 years after Heath had entered Downing Street, the long process was heading for the end game. The date of the referendum was now set for the 5th of June, 1975. Public opinion was 2-1 against membership. The anti-Europeans in the Labour Party were riding high. They were cruelly deceived. The pro-European lobby had been waiting for this for a long time and had money to burn.
Over the last few weeks, Conservative, Liberal and Labour Party leaders have been travelling the country talking to all sorts of people in all sorts of places. Whatever their differences, on this issue, these politicians are united as never before.
If we came out of the community, the effect on investment here would be damaging.
We'll get the benefit. The areas of high unemployment, the development areas, the whole of Scotland will benefit.
We know there'll be fewer jobs if we come out.
It doesn't make any difference whether you're in or outside as to what happens to food prices. They're much the same, in or out.
With nearly £1.5 million in their coffers, the pro-Europe lobby could afford a slick campaign.
The facts. It's a good one. Find out the facts.
The anti-marketeers had just £133,000 to spend and a bit of help from the trade unions.
Starting in the north with Newcastle.
Right. And then
we were massive. I mean, it was a huge organisation. There were 3 of us. There was me, and there was Bob Harrison, who was donated to us by Jack Jones. And then we had in fact, I think to start with, it was just the 2 of us.
It was a no contest from the start. They had the ability and they did wage a very efficient and sophisticated campaign because they had the financing to do it.
I was going off to have lunch with some friends.
Have you made any more us about your feelings?
No.
With imperfect timing, the Tories dropped the pilot. 3 months before the referendum, they dumped Heath for Margaret Thatcher.
Thank you very much. And these are
In those days, Mrs. Thatcher campaigned for Europe with gusto.
We want a jumper parade. Come on, we want a jumper parade. It's very fitting that you should keep an all-night vigil under a statue of Sir Winston Churchill, the first person to have the great vision of working together for peace in Europe.
Now, can you just make one hand out?
Yes.
And Heath, for a brief and never-repeated shining moment, swallowed his pride and fought side by side with his nemesis.
Is Europe stronger with Britain a member? Yes.
The visiting speeches, which will start in a moment, are from Jeremy Thorpe and Edward Heath for the motion.
On the eve of the only national referendum in British history came one of those bizarre rituals of British life, the obligatory debate at the Oxford Union.
The Union was crammed. And what was quite clear, even before we started the debate, was that the undergraduates were overwhelmingly in favour of staying in. It was the most pro-European meeting of the Oxford Union I've ever attended. Heath got a great cheer. And I had a clash with Jeremy Thorpe.
They lured us into the market with the mirage of the market miracle.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady
may we assume that if the vote is yes, she would not stay on to administer those policies as a minister?
So I had to think on my feet, and I said, if the vote goes yes, my country will need me to save it. And of course there were jeers, and Jeremy Thorpe did a sort of mock halo round his head, and the undergraduates all jeered and the rest of it.
But Castle and her crowd had been deserted by some old comrades. Monsieur Non had become Monsieur Oui.
First of all, please make sure that you go and vote in the common market referendum on Thursday. And secondly, the government asks you to vote yes, clearly and unmistakably.
On Thursday, vote yes. Keep Britain in Europe.
One working class woman came up to me and she said, Barbara, I was very impressed by what you said. But you see, Harold's in favour, isn't he? And I suddenly realised then that that would carry weight with a lot of Labour voters. After all, they just voted him to government. Why should they vote against him on this? So the whole psychology was against us as well as the money bags.
On the 5th of June, the votes came in. They were decisive. By a majority of 2 to 1, Britain had voted to stay within the community. The anti-marketeers had lost, but there were casualties among the victors too. For Wilson, the years of fudge and manoeuvre had taken their toll.
He got a great deal of criticism. His esteem in the press and everywhere else went very low indeed. He minded that a lot. I know he minded it. And he was never quite the same man after that, in my view.
But nor was Jenkins. The man who had once been thought most likely to succeed never did.
It was a very foolish thing to do, to resign the deputy leadership, because if he hadn't, he would have been leader instead of Callaghan, there's no question, in 1976.
The truth was that the long, bruising battle to get in had left both main parties damaged. Only the most passionate devotees to the European cause could argue that they had not been harmed.
Churchill didn't suffer from it. Macmillan didn't suffer from it. Hume certainly didn't suffer from it. I haven't suffered from it.
Perhaps Harold Wilson suffered from it. James Callaghan a bit, Margaret Thatcher, and indeed the present situation.
Well, maybe. You must ask them.
Got to get in to get on. You must move ahead or we fall behind. Nothing in life stays the same. You got to get in to get on. Move into the new world, come out of the past. Your doubts and your worries will disappear fast. Take a big step and move into tomorrow today. We got to get in to get on. We must move ahead or we fall behind. Nothing in life stays the same. You got to get in to get on.
Stamp to the travel show essential